Sometimes a moment is so small that no one else notices it, but it quietly changes the way you see everything. For me, that moment happened in a kitchen, standing across from my future daughter-in-law, while she looked down at a clipboard and said something that made the room feel strangely cold. But before I tell you what she said, let me tell you who I am, because stories like this don't start with weddings. They start years earlier with love, family, and the quiet belief that you belong somewhere. My name is Carol. I'm 64 years old. I live in a small, peaceful house in Asheville, North Carolina, tucked between tall trees and winding mountain roads. It's the kind of place where mornings are quiet and the coffee tastes better when the sun rises over the hills. I've lived there for more than 20 years now. It used to be louder when my husband Frank was alive. He had this deep laugh that filled every room, the kind of laugh that made other people start laughing too. Ha ha ha, sometimes I can still hear it in my memory when the house gets too quiet. Frank passed away 12 years ago. Heart attack, quick, sudden, the kind of thing that leaves you sitting in a hospital chair staring at the wall, thinking, sigh, how can someone be here one moment and gone the next? Those were hard years, truly hard, but I had one thing that kept me steady. My son Daniel has always been the center of my world. I know some people say mothers shouldn't say things like that, but it's simply the truth. When you raise a child, when you watch them grow from this tiny little bundle wrapped in blankets into a grown man with responsibilities and dreams, well, a piece of your heart just stays with them forever. It's not something you can turn off. Daniel was born during a snowstorm, believe it or not. The roads were terrible that morning. Frank and I tried to get to the hospital, but the car kept sliding on the icy road. Eventually, a neighbor drove us in his old pickup truck, and by the time we got there, Daniel was already on his way into the world. I remember holding him for the first time and thinking, this little person is going to change everything, and he did. Daniel grew into the kind of man any parent would be proud of. Thoughtful, responsible, quietly kind. When his father got sick years later, Daniel would call him every Sunday just to read him the sports scores, even when Frank was too tired to respond. That's the kind of son he is. Loyal. Gentle, the kind who shows love in small, steady ways. For many years, it was just the two of us after Frank passed. We talked every Sunday evening. It became our routine. I'd make tea, sit by the kitchen window, and the phone would ring right around 7. Sometimes we'd talk about serious things, sometimes we'd just laugh about something silly that happened during the week. Those calls meant everything to me. Daniel was married once before. Her name was Renee, and I'll tell you something honestly, I liked Renee, I really did. She was funny, practical, easy to talk to. Their marriage lasted about 9 years before it ended, but even after the divorce we stayed friendly because she's the mother of my 2 grandchildren, Marcus and Sophie. Those kids are my sunshine. Marcus is 13 now, tall and thoughtful like his dad. Sophie is 10, full of energy and questions and little giggles that sound like wind chimes. Those two can brighten even the darkest day. The divorce between Daniel and Renee was sad, but it wasn't ugly. Sometimes life just changes directions. They both handled it like adults, which I respected. Then, about 4 years ago, Daniel met someone new. Her name was Patris. Now listen, I'm not the kind of woman who judges people too quickly. I really try to give everyone a fair chance, so when Daniel told me he wanted to bring Patris to Thanksgiving dinner, I was happy to meet her. I even asked Daniel what kind of food she liked so I could make something special. She loves sweet potato casserole, he told me, so I made the best sweet potato casserole I could. Brown sugar topping, cinnamon, a little extra butter, the works. I even gave up my usual seat at the head of the table so Patris wouldn't feel like she was stepping into someone else's place. I wanted her to feel welcome. Truly, that first Thanksgiving dinner actually went pretty well. Patris was polite. She laughed at the right moments. She helped clear the dishes afterward. If you had walked into the room, you probably would have thought everything was perfectly normal, but sometimes you can feel something even when you can't explain it. Every now and then when Patris looked at me, there was this tiny pause. Just a fraction of a second, like she was measuring something, thinking about something behind her smile. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. You know how the mind can play tricks on you sometimes. I thought maybe I was just being overly protective of my son, so I pushed that feeling aside. Months passed. Daniel and Patris kept dating. Eventually, they moved in together in Charlotte. That meant Daniel was about 2 hours away from me now, but that was all right. 2 hours isn't so bad when you're used to driving mountain roads. Still, something began to change slowly. Our Sunday phone calls became shorter. Sometimes Daniel sounded distracted, other times he'd say things like, maybe we can push your visit back a week or two. Patris has been busy. Little things like that, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just small shifts, the kind that make you pause and think, that's strange. About 18 months after they started dating, Daniel texted me one evening. Just a photo of Patris's hand with a beautiful ring on her finger, 3 heart emojis. That's how I found out my son was getting married. I stared at that message for a long moment before typing back, congratulations. I'm very happy for you both, and I meant it. Truly, but somewhere deep inside. A tiny voice whispered something I didn't want to hear, because sometimes the beginning of a story doesn't feel like a beginning at all. Sometimes it feels like the quiet start of something you don't yet understand. And a year later, standing in that kitchen with Patris looking at me across the island, that strange feeling finally turned into something real, something clear, something that started with just 6 simple words. Not on the seating chart. And when I heard those words, I had no idea that a single table number would soon change the entire wedding, but that part of the story, well, that came a little later. When Patris said those words to me in that kitchen, "You're not on the seating chart," I remember blinking for a second, like my mind needed a moment to catch up with what I had just heard. It wasn't what she said exactly, it was how calmly she said it. No apology, no hesitation. Just a simple statement, like she was pointing out the weather. But before we go further into that moment, I need to explain how things slowly changed between Daniel and me after Patris came into his life. Because moments like that don't just appear out of nowhere. They build quietly over time, one small shift after another. At first, everything seemed normal. Daniel was happy, and that was what mattered to me. When you're a parent, you learn something important. Your child's happiness often becomes more important than your own comfort. So I welcomed Patris the best way I knew how. The next few times I visited Charlotte, I brought little things with me. A pie one time, fresh jam another time, just small gestures. Patris always thanked me politely. She was never rude, not directly anyway. But there was always this invisible wall around her, like she was carefully deciding how close I was allowed to stand. The first real change happened about 6 months after they started dating. Daniel called me on a Sunday evening, like he always did. But his voice sounded careful. You know how someone sounds when they're choosing their words very slowly? That was Daniel that night. He cleared his throat and said, "Hey Mom, Patris mentioned something earlier and I wanted to talk to you about it." I remember leaning back in my kitchen chair, stirring my tea slowly. "Of course," I said. "What's on your mind?" "Well," he said, "Patris feels like things have been moving a little fast between everyone. She thinks it might help if we spread visits out a bit, just until she gets more comfortable." Now, if you're listening to that, you might think it sounds perfectly reasonable. And maybe it was. Relationships take time to settle. People need space, so I smiled, even though Daniel couldn't see me through the phone. "Of course," I told him. "That makes sense," and I meant it, but something small changed after that. Before Patris, I used to visit Daniel about once a month. Sometimes we'd cook dinner together. Sometimes we'd go for a walk downtown or watch a baseball game on TV. Those little visits meant the world to me. After that phone call, the visits started stretching out, once every 6 weeks, then once every 2 months. Each time Daniel would say something like, "This weekend might not be great, Mom. Maybe next time." Again, nothing dramatic, just small adjustments. Still, I told myself it was normal. New relationships come with new rhythms. People need time to figure things out. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who made things harder, so I stayed patient. And Daniel always sounded grateful for that patience. About a year later, Daniel proposed to Patris like I mentioned earlier. I found out through a text message. A picture of her hand with a sparkling diamond ring. I stared at that picture for a while before replying. Not because I wasn't happy for them, but because something about that moment felt distant. I suppose I had imagined that news being shared over a phone call, maybe even in person, but times change. People communicate differently these days. I pushed the thought away and focused on the important thing. My son was starting a new chapter of his life and I wanted to support him. The wedding planning started soon after that. Or at least that's what I heard from Daniel. I never really saw the planning. No one asked me to help pick a venue. No one asked my opinion on flowers or colors or music. Patris's family handled most of that. Her mother, Diane, was apparently very involved, and honestly, that was all right with me. Every bride deserves to plan her wedding the way she wants. I didn't expect to be in charge of anything. I just wanted to show up, smile, hug my son, and celebrate the day he married someone he loved. That's all a mother really hopes for. Then one morning, about 9 weeks before the wedding, the invitation arrived in my mailbox. It was beautiful, thick ivory paper. Elegant gold lettering. Inside the envelope was a tiny pressed flower that smelled faintly sweet when I opened it. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, smiling as I read the card. "Daniel Whitfield and Patris Lawson request the pleasure of your company." I felt proud reading those words. My son was getting married. I flipped the card over, expecting to see the usual details. Ceremony time, reception location, table number maybe. Instead, there was a smaller card tucked behind the invitation. "Seating will be arranged at the venue. Please arrive no earlier than 30 minutes before the ceremony." I read it twice, then I laughed softly to myself. "Well, that's a little unusual," I murmured. It didn't bother me at first. Weddings can be complicated. Maybe they were doing open seating for simplicity, but later that afternoon I spoke with my sister Linda on the phone. She had also received her invitation, and that's when I learned something strange. Linda had a card with a table number printed on it, so did my cousin. and Daniel's college friend, and several other relatives. Everyone else seemed to have a designated seat, everyone except me. Now, at that moment, I still believed it must have been a mistake. Weddings are chaotic things, lists get mixed up. Names get misplaced, so I called Daniel. He didn't answer right away, but I left a cheerful voicemail. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "I got the invitation today. It's beautiful. I just wanted to check something quickly. I noticed my card didn't have a table assignment on it. Did you want me to coordinate with someone about seating?" That evening, Daniel called me back. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "Patris is handling all the seating stuff. I'm sure she'll reach out." "All right," I said, "just checking." And that was that, or at least that's what I thought, because Patris never called. Days passed, then weeks, no message, no explanation. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it. I told myself I would figure it out when I arrived at the wedding. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one still, every now and then. The thought drifted back into my mind, a small question that refused to disappear. Why did everyone else have a seat except the groom's mother? But I pushed that thought aside, because the wedding was getting closer, and 1 week before the ceremony, I decided something very simple. I was going to drive to Charlotte a little early, just to help. After all, I had raised Daniel for 31 years. Helping him prepare for one of the biggest days of his life felt like the most natural thing in the world. What I didn't realize at the time was that arriving early would lead to the moment where Patris looked at me across that kitchen island, glanced down at her clipboard, and calmly told me something that made the room go very, very quiet. And when she finally explained where I would be sitting at the wedding, well, that's when I first heard the words "Table 14. The wedding invitation sat on my kitchen table for days after that phone call with Daniel. Not because I was upset, not really, but because something about it kept pulling my attention back. You know how sometimes you glance at something again and again without knowing exactly why? That's how it felt. Every morning when I poured my coffee, there it was, that elegant ivory card with the gold lettering catching the sunlight through my window. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. Whoever designed it had excellent taste. A small pressed flower was tucked neatly inside the envelope, delicate and pale pink, like something from a garden in early spring. I remember picking it up again one afternoon and reading the invitation slowly. "Daniel Whitfield and Patris Lawson request the pleasure of your company." I smiled when I read Daniel's name. I always do. When you raise someone from the time they're small enough to sit on your shoulders, seeing their name printed like that on something so important, well, it fills you with a quiet kind of pride. But that smaller card still puzzled me. "Seating will be arranged at the venue. No table number, no seat assignment." Just that one sentence. At first, like I told you, I assumed it was a mistake. Weddings are complicated, lists get long, things slip through the cracks. It happens all the time, so I didn't worry about it much. Still, curiosity is a funny thing. Later that week, I ran into my neighbor Martha at the grocery store. Martha has known Daniel since he was 10 years old. She used to bring cookies over when Frank was still alive, and she always asks about the grandchildren. We were standing in the cereal aisle when she said, "Oh, Carol, I received Daniel's wedding invitation yesterday." "It's gorgeous," I smiled. "It really is." Then she added something that made my eyebrows lift just slightly. "My table number is on the card, table 6, I believe." I nodded politely. "That's nice," but inside my mind something quietly clicked. Table 6, so the seating had already been decided. I didn't say anything at the store. There was no reason to make it awkward. But when I got home, I found myself thinking about it again. I even chuckled softly to myself. "Huh," I murmured while putting the groceries away. Maybe mine just got missed. It still didn't feel like a big deal. Not yet. A couple days later, my sister Linda called. Now Linda is the kind of person who notices everything. If someone changes their hairstyle by half an inch, Linda will be the first to mention it. We chatted for a few minutes about the kids, the weather, the usual things. Then she said, "Did you see the seating card in the invitation?" I paused. "Yes," I said carefully. "I'm at table 3, she said proudly. "Right near the front." "That's lovely," I replied. Then she asked casually, "Where are you sitting?" There was a small silence between us, and I realized something slightly awkward. "I actually didn't receive a table number," I said lightly. "Mine just said seating would be arranged at the venue." Linda went quiet for a moment, then she said slowly, "That's odd." I shrugged, even though she couldn't see me. "Probably just an oversight." "Maybe," she said, but her voice had that thoughtful tone she gets when she's noticing something unusual. After we hung up, I stood by the kitchen sink for a minute, looking out at the trees behind my house. The wind was moving through the branches gently, making that soft whispering sound. Leaves make. I sighed. "Don't overthink things," I told myself out loud, because that's the truth about moments like this. You always have a choice. You can assume the best, or you can assume the worst, and I have always tried to assume the best, so I decided to do something simple. I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom," he said warmly. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied. "I just had a quick question." "Sure." "I noticed my invitation didn't have a table assignment. I just wanted to check if there's anything I should coordinate with Patris about." There was a brief pause on the line, not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it. "Oh yeah," Daniel said finally. "Patris is handling the seating chart. She's been working on it for weeks. I'm sure she'll reach out if there's anything you need to know." "All right," I said, "just wanted to make sure." We chatted a little longer about Marcus's baseball games and Sophie's school play. Normal conversation, comfortable conversation. By the time we hung up, the question had mostly drifted out of my mind again. After all, the wedding was still weeks away, plenty of time for small details to be sorted out, and life went on as usual for a while. I tended my little garden in the backyard. I visited Marcus and Sophie one weekend. Sophie insisted on painting my nails bright purple, which made me laugh because purple has never been my color. "Ha ha ha, Sophie," I said, looking at my fingers. "Grandma is going to scare the neighbors with these nails." She giggled and said, "You look fabulous." Kids have a way of making everything lighter still, every now and then when the house was quiet in the evening. That little question returned, why had Patris never called? But eventually the wedding week arrived, and with it came a decision that felt perfectly natural to me. I would drive to Charlotte 2 days early, not because anyone asked me to, but because that's what mothers do. I figured there might be last-minute things to help with. Maybe someone needed to pick up flowers, maybe chairs needed arranging. Maybe the grandchildren would want company, so I packed a small suitcase, folded my burgundy dress carefully, and started the drive toward Charlotte early Thursday morning. The mountains were beautiful that day. The sky was clear, the air crisp. I even turned on the radio and sang along with an old song Frank used to love. For a moment I felt light, almost excited. My son was getting married, I was going to be there, and I truly believed everything would be wonderful. I arrived at Daniel and Patris's house late that afternoon. Cars were parked everywhere. Flower boxes sat on the porch. Through the windows I could see people moving around quickly inside, the kind of busy energy that always surrounds weddings. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened. Patris stood there wearing a silk robe. Her hair rolled up in curlers. For a split second, when she saw me standing on the porch with my suitcase, something flickered across her face, surprise, maybe even irritation. But it disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a polite smile. "Carol," she said. "You're here," I smiled back warmly. "Of course," I said. "I wouldn't miss this weekend for anything." She stepped aside to let me in. The house was buzzing with activity. Flower arrangements covered the dining table. Garment bags hung from door frames. Patris's mother, Deanne, sat at the kitchen island with a glass of wine and a clipboard full of notes. Everything looked organized, planned, carefully controlled. Daniel came in from the backyard a moment later when he heard my voice. His face lit up the moment he saw me. "Mom," he pulled me into a hug so tight it made my eyes sting a little. For a second, everything felt perfectly normal again. I remember thinking, "See, you were worrying for nothing." But a few minutes later, standing at that kitchen island, Patris glanced down at her clipboard, then looked up at me with a calm expression. And that was the moment she said something that made the room suddenly feel much colder, because that was when she explained exactly where I would be sitting at the wedding, and the number she mentioned was table 14. The kitchen was busy that afternoon, the kind of busy that happens right before a big wedding weekend. Flower boxes covered the counters, ribbons were scattered across the table, and someone had left 3 different coffee cups near the sink like people had been moving too fast to finish them. It should have felt joyful. Weddings are supposed to feel joyful. But standing there near the kitchen island, I suddenly felt like I had walked into someone else's house instead of my son's home. Patris's mother, Deanne, sat at the island with a clipboard and a glass of white wine. She looked very comfortable, like she had been in charge of the whole place for days. She gave me a polite nod when I walked in, the kind of nod you give a distant neighbor you see once or twice a year. Daniel had stepped back outside for a moment to talk to the caterer. I could see him through the window pacing near the patio, holding his phone, looking a little stressed but still excited. Seeing him like that made my heart soften again. This was his big weekend. Of course there would be chaos. Of course everyone would be busy. I set my suitcase near the hallway and smiled at Patris. "Well," I said lightly, "looks like there's a lot going on in here. Just tell me where I can help." She gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, we've actually got most things handled," she said. "But thank you." That's when she glanced down at the clipboard in front of her, flipping one page slowly. I remember the sound of the paper moving, that soft shhh sound. Something about it made the moment feel strangely official, like she was reviewing a list rather than talking to family. "Carol," she said calmly, "I just wanted to go over a few weekend logistics with you." "Of course," I replied, pulling out one of the kitchen stools. I sat across from her at the island. Diane remained beside her, quietly sipping her wine and occasionally looking down at the notes. Patris rested her pen against the clipboard and began speaking in a very organized tone. "So tomorrow evening is the rehearsal dinner," she said. "That will be family only." I nodded. "That makes sense. Immediate family," she clarified. "Parents and siblings." "Well," I said with a small chuckle, "I suppose that includes me." Yes, she replied quickly. You're included. Her voice wasn't rude, not exactly, but there was a certain firmness to it, like someone explaining rules to a guest. She continued flipping through her notes. The ceremony on Saturday will be fairly formal, she said. We've arranged the seating by relationship priority. That phrase caught my attention. Relationship priority? Yes, she said. Parents and close relatives will be seated toward the front rows. Extended family and friends further back. I nodded slowly. That seemed reasonable enough. Then I asked the simplest question in the world. So where will I be sitting? Patris glanced down at the clipboard again. For a moment she didn't answer. She just read something silently on the page, then she looked up at me. We have you at table 14, she said. Her tone was casual, matter of fact, like she was telling me the weather forecast. For a second I didn't react. I just repeated the number quietly in my head. Table 14. I pictured the room in my mind. Large wedding receptions usually place the important family tables near the front, lower numbers near the stage. Higher numbers further away. Table 14 would likely be somewhere near the back. Still, I kept my voice calm. Oh, I said gently. And the ceremony seating? Patris tapped her pen against the clipboard. For the ceremony, we're doing general seating for some guests, she explained. You can arrive early and find a good spot. General seating. I sat there for a moment, letting the words settle. Parents and siblings in the front rows. General seating for me. I glanced at Diane. She suddenly seemed very interested in the wine glass she was holding. The kitchen felt strangely quiet. Even the refrigerator humming in the corner seemed louder than usual. Finally I nodded. I see. Patris smiled slightly. I hope that's okay. Her voice had a certain tone to it. A calm certainty, like someone who had already made the decision and expected it to be accepted. And in that moment, I realized something. For the last 3 years I had been trying to name the feeling I got whenever Patris looked at me. That small pause behind her smile. That careful distance. Now I finally had a word for it. Ownership. She looked at me like someone who had stepped into a house and quietly rearranged the furniture. Like the space belonged to her now. I folded my hands together on the counter. That's fine, I said softly, because what else could I say? It was my son's wedding weekend. The house was full of preparations, flowers everywhere. Dresses hanging from door frames, everyone moving quickly to finish last-minute details. Starting an argument at that moment would help no one, so I simply stood up. Well, I said gently, I'll take my suitcase upstairs. Patris nodded toward the hallway. Guest room is at the end on the left. The room was small but tidy. A single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked directly toward the neighbor's wooden fence. I set my suitcase on the bed and sat down for a moment. The house was quieter up there. I could hear faint voices from the kitchen below. Patris and her mother speaking in low, steady tones. The sound of someone moving chairs across the floor. I sat there on the edge of that bed for several minutes, but I didn't cry. Let me be clear about that. I have lived long enough to understand that tears don't always solve things. I buried my husband 12 years ago. I raised a child through grief and uncertainty. I've faced much harder days than a seating chart. Still, something inside me shifted slightly in that quiet room, because when someone places you carefully at the edge of a room, it's rarely an accident. I leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. And suddenly I remembered something Frank used to say. Frank had a way of giving advice in short, simple sentences. One of his favorites was this: Carol, you don't fight for a seat at a table where you're not wanted. I could almost hear his voice saying it. I smiled faintly. Sigh. Well, Frank, I whispered softly, I guess we'll see how this weekend goes. Downstairs, I heard Daniel's voice laughing with someone. That warm laugh of his that always sounded a little like his father, and hearing that laugh reminded me why I had come. This weekend wasn't about Patris. It wasn't about table numbers. It was about my son. So I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked back downstairs to join the wedding chaos. What I didn't realize yet was that table 14 wasn't going to be the most important moment of that weekend, because sometimes the most unexpected things happen after dinner, when a microphone suddenly appears and someone calls your name in front of 200 people, and that moment was coming sooner than I ever imagined. That night, after the conversation in the kitchen and the quiet moment in the guest room, the house slowly settled into the strange rhythm that happens before a wedding. People moved around with purpose. Phone calls came and went. Someone was always asking where the tape was, or the scissors, or the extra ribbons for the flower arrangements. From the hallway I could hear Patris and her mother talking softly downstairs, their voices steady and organized. Every now and then Diane's laugh floated up the staircase, a sharp little chuckle that echoed through the house. I stood in front of the small mirror in the guest room for a moment and took a slow breath. All right, I whispered to myself, because sometimes the best thing you can do in a moment like that is simply decide to keep moving. So I went back downstairs. Daniel was standing near the dining table looking over some papers with the caterer. When he saw me walk in, his face brightened immediately. Mom, there you are, he said, walking over quickly. He wrapped me in one of those big, warm hugs that always remind me he's still my little boy somewhere inside that grown man. You made it, he said with a smile. Of course I made it, I laughed softly. You think I'd miss this weekend? He looked relieved just seeing me there. Weddings can make anyone nervous, and Daniel has always been the kind of person who carries responsibility quietly on his shoulders. We talked for a few minutes about the drive from Asheville and about Marcus's latest baseball game. Normal conversation, comfortable conversation. For a moment everything felt exactly the way it used to, then Petrus appeared at the doorway and called his name. Daniel, the florist, is on the phone. He nodded and squeezed my shoulder before walking away. I'll be right back, he said. I watched him step into the kitchen, already focused on the next problem that needed solving. Weddings do that to people. They turn everything into a schedule, a list, a plan that must run perfectly. The rehearsal dinner that evening was held at a small restaurant a few minutes away. It was a nice place, warm lighting, wooden tables, soft music playing in the background. The kind of place that tries to feel cozy even when it's hosting 20 people at once, everyone gathered around one long table. I noticed right away that Petrus's parents sat near the center with Daniel and Petrus beside them. The groomsmen and bridesmaids filled most of the other seats. I ended up near the end of the table. On one side of me sat a cousin of Petrus's I had never met before. On the other side was an empty chair that apparently belonged to a groomsman who was running late. It wasn't a big deal. Seating at rehearsal dinners is usually casual. Still, I noticed Petrus never came over to speak with me once the entire evening. Daniel did. He leaned down beside me halfway through dinner and whispered, "You look wonderful tonight, Mom." I smiled at him. "Thank you." "Sweetheart." For a moment he looked like he wanted to say something more. But someone called his name from across the table and he had to turn away. The rest of the evening passed politely enough. People laughed, they toasted, they told stories about how Daniel and Petrus met. I listened and smiled when appropriate, occasionally glancing around the table. Every once in a while I caught Diane watching me quietly from across the room, like she was measuring my reactions. But I kept my composure. Frank used to say something that always stuck with me. He'd say, "Carol, dignity is quiet. You don't have to announce it." I thought about that while I sipped my glass of wine. After dinner, everyone slowly began heading back to their cars. The air outside had cooled a little and the parking lot lights cast long shadows across the pavement. Daniel walked me to my rental car. "Thanks for coming tonight," he said. "It means a lot." I looked at him carefully. "Of course it does," I replied gently. "I'm your mother." For a moment I almost asked him about the seating chart. The words were right there on the tip of my tongue. "Do you know where I'm sitting tomorrow?" But something stopped me. This was the night before his wedding. He looked tired, excited, nervous all at once. I didn't want to place another weight on his shoulders, so instead I simply hugged him. "Get some sleep," I said. "Tomorrow is a big day." He laughed softly. "Yeah, I'll try." When I drove back to the house that night, the streets were quiet. The headlights from my car stretched across the road like long white ribbons. Back in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed again and slipped off my shoes. The house was almost silent now. That's when Frank's voice returned to my mind again. The way memories sometimes do when everything is still. He had another saying I always loved. "Carol," he'd say, "if someone gives you the worst seat in the room, sometimes it's because they're afraid of what you might say." I chuckled quietly to myself. "Ha ha ha, you always did have a way with words, Frank." But I shook my head. "No," I murmured. "Tomorrow I'll just sit quietly and enjoy the wedding. Because that's what mothers do. We show up, we support, we celebrate, even when the seating chart doesn't quite make sense." Before going to bed, I hung my dress carefully on the closet door. It was a deep burgundy color I had chosen months earlier, something elegant but simple. I smoothed the fabric gently and imagined the ceremony the next afternoon, my son walking down the aisle, music playing, guests smiling, and me sitting somewhere in the crowd watching him begin the next chapter of his life. That thought made me smile, because in the end, it wasn't about where I sat. At least, that's what I believed that night. What I didn't know yet was that the wedding itself would be beautiful, truly beautiful. But the reception afterward would reveal exactly what table 14 really meant and why the number would stay in my memory forever. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the guest room, painting soft lines across the floor. For a moment I just lay there, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. Footsteps downstairs. Someone opening and closing cabinets. The low hum of a hairdryer somewhere down the hallway. Weddings always begin that way, calm on the surface, while underneath everyone is racing against the clock. I sat up slowly and stretched, letting out a small sigh. "Well," I whispered to myself, "today's the day." For a few seconds I just sat there thinking about Daniel. It's strange how time moves. One minute you're tying a child's shoelaces before school, and the next minute you're watching them get married. Life has a funny way of speeding up when you're not looking. I got dressed slowly, taking my time with the burgundy dress I had hung the night before. It fit nicely, simple but elegant. I brushed my hair carefully, added a small necklace Frank had given me years ago, and looked at myself in the mirror. "All right, Carol," I said quietly. "Let's go celebrate your son." Downstairs, the house was already buzzing again. Patris and her bridesmaids were moving quickly between rooms with makeup bags and curling irons. Diane stood in the kitchen giving instructions like a general organizing troops. Daniel came downstairs wearing a white shirt and tie, still adjusting the cuffs. When he saw me, he smiled that same warm smile he's had since he was a little boy. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said. "Thank you," I replied. For a moment we stood there together, and I could see the excitement in his eyes. Not nervous exactly, just full of anticipation. "I can't believe this is happening," he said with a small laugh. "Oh, I can," I teased gently. "You've been practicing patience your whole life," he laughed. That's true. After a quick breakfast, everyone began heading to the venue. The ceremony was being held at a restored farmhouse outside Charlotte, surrounded by tall oak trees and rolling hills. When I arrived, I had to admit something. It was stunning. White lights were strung through the branches of the trees. Rows of wooden chairs lined the gentle slope of a grassy hill facing the mountains. A soft breeze moved through the leaves, carrying that fresh outdoor smell you only get in the countryside. Patris really had planned a beautiful wedding. I stood there for a moment just taking it in. Sometimes you have to give credit where it's due. A young woman wearing black approached me with a clipboard. "Good afternoon," she said politely. "Are you here for the ceremony?" "Yes," I replied with a smile. She scanned her list briefly. "General seating is just over there," she said, pointing toward the middle rows. "General seating." I nodded calmly. "Thank you." I walked across the grass and found an empty chair about 10 rows back on the left side. It actually had a pretty good view of the aisle. I smoothed my dress as I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. Guests began arriving steadily after that. Soft conversations floated through the air. Someone laughed nearby. The musicians started warming up quietly near the front. Then suddenly I heard a familiar voice. "Grandma." I turned just in time to see Sophie running toward me across the grass, her little shoes kicking up tiny bits of dirt as she hurried over. "Ah, that girl always runs like she's on a mission." She wrapped her arms around me tightly. "You look so pretty," she said. Looking up at my dress, I laughed softly. "Well, thank you, sweetheart." Marcus walked up behind her, taller now than he was last year. He gave me one of those quick teenage hugs that boys do when they're trying to look cool. "Hey, Grandma," he said. "Hey yourself," I replied, squeezing his shoulder. Renee stood a few steps behind them, smiling warmly. "It's good to see you," she said. "You too," I told her. "Renee and I have always managed to stay kind to each other despite everything life has thrown our way. Some relationships survive changes because both people decide they matter." The kids sat beside me during the ceremony. Sophie slipped her small hand into mine as the music began, and for a moment I forgot completely about seating charts and table numbers. This was enough, just being there, just watching my son walk down the aisle. When Daniel appeared between his groomsmen, the crowd stood. I felt a sudden lump in my throat as I watched him step forward. He looked so much like Frank in that moment, something about the way he carried himself. That same quiet strength. My heart swelled with pride. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Simple and sincere. Patris looked lovely in her dress, and Daniel couldn't stop smiling at her. As they exchanged vows, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the sunlight filtered through the branches like something out of a movie. For that entire half hour, none of the earlier discomfort mattered. I was simply a mother watching her son promise his life to someone he loved, and despite everything, I truly wished them happiness. When the ceremony ended, everyone applauded as the couple walked back down the aisle together. Then guests began moving toward the farmhouse for the reception. Inside the building, round tables filled the large hall. White linens, soft lights hanging from wooden beams. Flowers everywhere. I walked slowly around the room until I found it. Table 14. It was exactly where I expected it would be, near the back right beside the kitchen door. Every few seconds waiters passed through that door carrying trays of food and clattering dishes. I sat down quietly and looked around the table. None of the faces were familiar. Two women who appeared to be Patris's college friends. A cousin of hers I had briefly seen the night before. A man who turned out to be the event coordinator accidentally seated there while checking arrangements. No family, no close friends, just strangers. I picked up my glass of champagne and took a small sip. "Well," I murmured softly to myself, then I gave a little shrug. It was only a table, but what I didn't realize at that moment, sitting quietly beside the kitchen door, was that something unexpected was about to happen, because later that evening, after dinner, after the music started, after the speeches began, someone at the front of the room would suddenly say a name into the microphone, and that name would belong to me. Table 14 was exactly where I expected it would be, near the back of the room, almost tucked against the wall beside the swinging kitchen door. Every few minutes that door would open with a soft push, and waiters carrying trays of food would step through quickly. The the plates clinking together as they hurried toward the other tables. I sat down and smoothed the fabric of my dress over my knees. Well, I murmured quietly to myself, then I glanced around the table. The guests seated with me were pleasant enough. Two women who seemed to be Patris's college friends were chatting about their flights and hotel rooms. A young man introduced himself as her cousin from Atlanta. Another gentleman sat across from me looking slightly confused until he admitted he was actually the venue's event coordinator and had accidentally taken the wrong seat while checking the room setup. We all laughed a little about that. Ha ha ha, well, I told him, raising my glass slightly, you picked an excellent table. Humor is a useful thing in moments like that. It keeps things light when your heart might be feeling a little heavier than you expected. Across the room, I could see the main family tables near the dance floor. Patris's parents were seated there, surrounded by relatives and close friends. The bridesmaids and groomsmen were nearby as well, laughing and taking pictures. Daniel and Patris moved through the crowd greeting guests during the cocktail hour. Every so often people stood to hug them or shake their hands. Eventually they made their way toward the back of the room. When Daniel reached table 14, he leaned down and wrapped me in a quick hug. "Hey Mom," he said warmly. "Hi sweetheart," I replied. "You doing okay back here?" he asked. I smiled and nodded. Of course I am, and that was the truth. I wasn't angry, not really, just aware. Patris stood beside him, smiling politely at the group around the table. "So glad you could make it, Carol," she said. Her tone was friendly enough, though something about it sounded distant, almost formal. Then they moved on to the next table. I watched them walk away through the crowd. "Nice couple," one of the women at my table said. "Yes," I replied quietly. "They are." Dinner was served shortly afterward. Plates of roasted chicken and vegetables appeared, carried in by the same waiters who kept passing through the kitchen door behind us. The conversation at the table was easy and light. People asked where I lived, how long I had known Daniel, little polite questions like that. When I mentioned I was his mother, there was a brief pause of surprise. "Oh," one of the women said. "We didn't realize," I chuckled softly. "That seems to be happening a lot tonight." She looked a little embarrassed. "I just assumed family would be sitting closer to the front." I waved my hand gently. "Oh, it's all right," and truly. In that moment, I meant it, because while I sat there sipping my champagne, I found myself thinking again about something Frank used to say. Frank always believed that the way people treat you often reveals more about them than it does about you. He had a simple way of explaining things like that. "Carol," he would say, "respect is quiet. And so is dignity." I thought about that while the music started up and people began drifting toward the dance floor. Marcus and Sophie came running over after dinner. "Grandma," Sophie said, climbing onto the chair beside me. "Is sitting way back here." I laughed. "Yes, I am." Marcus glanced around the table curiously. "You should be sitting up there," he said, pointing toward the front. Kids notice things adults try to ignore. I squeezed his shoulder gently. "It's all right," I told him. "I've got a perfectly good view from here." Sophie leaned closer and whispered loudly, "Your dress is still the prettiest one here." That made me laugh out loud. "Thank you, sweetheart." The kids ran back toward the dance floor a few minutes later, leaving me smiling after them. Then the DJ stepped forward with the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced cheerfully, "we're about to begin the toasts." The room quieted slightly as people returned to their seats. Patris's maid of honor went first. She told funny stories about their college years that had the whole room laughing. Ha ha ha, even I had to wipe a tear from my eye at one of them. Next came Patris's father. He spoke beautifully about his daughter, about watching her grow up and the pride he felt seeing her start a new chapter. Then Daniel's best man stepped forward. He had known my son for nearly 20 years. And his speech was full of the kind of stories only old friends can tell: late-night road trips, terrible college apartments. The first time Daniel tried to cook dinner and nearly set off the smoke alarm, the room was full of laughter. I sat there quietly at table 14, smiling into my champagne glass when the best man finished. He handed the microphone back to the DJ. The DJ glanced down at a small card in his hand. "And now," he said, "we'll hear from the groom's mother." For a moment the room filled with applause. People turned their heads toward the front tables, expecting someone to stand, but no one moved. The DJ looked slightly confused. He glanced at the card again, then he leaned back toward the microphone. "Carol Whitfield." There was a ripple through the room. Guests began looking around, searching for whoever that name belonged to at the front tables. Patris kept her smile perfectly in place. Daniel looked puzzled, and suddenly I realized something very interesting. No one seemed to know where the groom's mother was sitting. I slowly placed my champagne glass down on the table. "Well," I said softly to the people beside me, "that would be me." The woman next to me blinked in surprise. Giving a speech?" I gave a small shrug. "Apparently." Then I stood up, and as I stepped away from table 14 and began walking toward the front of the room, 200 pairs of eyes slowly turned in my direction. What none of them knew yet was that I hadn't prepared a speech at all. But sometimes the most important things you ever say are the words you never planned to speak. When the DJ called my name, the room did something strange. It went quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the curious kind. The kind that happens when 200 people are suddenly looking around trying to figure out where someone is sitting. I could see it happening all around the room, heads turning, guests whispering to each other, a few people scanning the front tables, clearly expecting the groom's mother to stand up somewhere near the stage, but no one moved, because the groom's mother was sitting beside the kitchen door at table 14. I set my champagne glass down gently on the table. "Well," I said quietly to the people around me, "that's me." The woman next to me blinked in surprise. "The groom's mother?" I smiled politely. "Yes, I am." Then I stood up. For a moment I smoothed my dress, just a simple instinct. The way you do before walking into a room. My hands were steady. That's something I remember clearly. Steady, not angry, not shaking, just steady. The walk from the back of the room to the front suddenly felt longer than it really was. As I moved between the tables, people began turning their chairs to watch. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. I heard someone whisper, "Oh, she was sitting back there." Another voice said softly, "That's Daniel's mom." I kept walking step by step. When I reached the DJ, he handed me the microphone with a polite smile, clearly relieved that the mystery had been solved. "Here you go," he said quietly. "Thank you." I replied. I turned toward the room. The lights above the dance floor cast a warm glow across the guests. 200 faces stared back at me, some curious, some confused, a few already smiling encouragingly. I glanced toward Daniel. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read yet. Surprise, certainly. Maybe a little concern. Patris sat beside him, her posture perfectly straight, her smile still in place. I took a slow breath, then I spoke. "Hello, everyone," I said. My voice sounded calm through the microphone, which surprised me slightly. "My name is Carol. I'm Daniel's mother." A small ripple of recognition moved through the room. A few guests nodded or smiled, then I added something simple. "I've been sitting at table 14 all evening, so some of you may not have had the chance to meet me." For a split second the room froze, not in a dramatic way, just a tiny pause, the kind of pause that happens when people suddenly understand something without anyone explaining it directly. A few heads turned subtly toward the back of the room. Someone coughed, then a soft murmur spread through the crowd. I kept my tone warm, gentle, almost conversational. "I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight," I continued. "In fact, I didn't even know I was on the schedule." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the room. "Ha ha ha, but since I'm here and since this microphone somehow found its way into my hands, I suppose I should say a few words about my son." I glanced at Daniel again. He looked a little emotional now. His eyes had softened the way they used to when he was younger. "You see," I said, "I've known Daniel his entire life, which means I've had the privilege of watching him grow from a small boy into the man standing here tonight." The room relaxed slightly. People leaned back in their chairs, ready for the usual wedding stories. "And let me tell you," I continued, smiling faintly, "Daniel has always been a thoughtful person. Even as a little kid." I paused for a moment. "When he was 7 years old, he started a habit that I've never forgotten. Every night before going to bed, he would line up all his shoes by the front door, perfectly straight. Sneakers, school shoes, everything." A few guests laughed softly. "Ha ha ha." I once asked him why he did that, and he said, "It helps me feel ready for tomorrow." The laughter grew warmer now, but that's the kind of person Daniel has always been. Someone who quietly prepares for the future, someone who thinks about the people around him. I looked across the room again. "I remember when his father got sick years ago," I said more softly. "Daniel used to call him every Sunday night just to read him the sports scores, even when Frank was too tired to answer. He did it because he wanted his father to know he was still there." The room grew very still again. I felt a small lump rise in my throat but kept going. A mother gets to see all the small moments that build a person's character. The ordinary moments. The ones that don't make it into speeches very often. I smiled gently. "And tonight I'm proud to say that the boy who lined up his shoes every night grew into a man who knows how to love people quietly and sincerely." Daniel lowered his head slightly. Blinking, I let the silence rest for a second before speaking again. "There's something else I've learned during the 31 years I've been Daniel's mother." My voice remained calm, but my words carried a little more weight now. "A mother's love is not a decoration." A few guests leaned forward slightly. "It doesn't sit at a specific table number." Another quiet pause. "It goes everywhere the child goes. Every day of their life, whether anyone notices it or not." The room was completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving behind the kitchen door. I turned my head slightly and looked at Patris for a moment, then I smiled again. "Patris," I said kindly, "I truly hope the two of you build a wonderful life together." Her smile remained in place, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the table. "And one day," I continued gently, "if you have children of your own, I hope someone loves them the way I love Daniel." Completely. Patiently, I paused one last time, from any table in the room. Then I handed the microphone back to the DJ. For a second nothing happened, just quiet, and then the room erupted. Applause rolled across the hall like a wave. Some guests even stood up. I saw Renee at a table near the middle with her hand over her mouth. Tears running down her face. Marcus was clapping enthusiastically. Sophie had climbed onto her chair. Cheering like she had just watched the end of a movie, I walked calmly back across the room, back past the curious faces, back to the seat beside the kitchen door. And when I sat down at table 14 again, my hands were still perfectly steady. What I didn't expect was what happened about 20 minutes later, because after the music started and the dance floor began to fill, someone approached my chair quietly, and when I looked down, I saw my son kneeling beside me. When I sat back down at table 14, the applause was still echoing through the room. For a few seconds I just sat there quietly, picking up my champagne glass again. My hands were steady, just like before. That surprised me a little, to be honest. Sometimes after you say something important, your body starts shaking afterward, but not that night. Instead, I felt calm. The people sitting around the table looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration. One of the women who had been chatting earlier leaned toward me and whispered, "That was one of the most beautiful speeches I've ever heard." I smiled politely. "Thank you," I said. Across the room, the DJ had started the music again, and the tension slowly melted away as guests returned to their conversations. Plates were cleared, glasses clinked. The dance floor began filling with people laughing and spinning beneath the lights. From the back of the room, table 14 almost felt like a quiet observation point. I watched Marcus and Sophie run toward the dance floor together, their excitement completely unfiltered. Sophie was already trying to drag Marcus into dancing while he pretended to resist. Kids are funny like that. They don't carry the same weight adults do. They see moments clearly, react honestly, and then move forward without overthinking everything. I took another sip of champagne and let out a slow breath sigh. "Well, Frank," I murmured softly to myself, "I think that went all right." About 20 minutes passed like that. Music played, guests laughed, someone started a line dance near the center of the floor. Then I noticed Daniel walking through the crowd. He wasn't greeting guests this time. He was moving more slowly, scanning the room until his eyes found me sitting at the back. When he reached the table, he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he crouched down beside my chair, just like he used to do when he was little and needed to tell me something important without everyone else hearing. For a moment we just looked at each other. His eyes were glossy, like he might be trying not to cry. Finally he spoke. "Mom," his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know." I tilted my head gently. "Didn't know what?" "About the seating," he said quietly. Table 14, for a moment neither of us spoke, then he shook his head slowly. "I swear to you I didn't know. Now, when you raise a child for 31 years, you learn something very valuable. You learn when they're telling the truth." And in that moment, looking at Daniel kneeling beside my chair with those same honest eyes he had as a boy, I knew he was, so I nodded. "I believe you." Relief washed over his face almost immediately. He exhaled a breath he'd probably been holding since my speech ended. "I feel terrible," he said. I reached down and placed my hand gently over his. "Daniel," I said softly, "tonight is your wedding. You don't need to feel terrible." "But I should have noticed," he insisted. "I should have looked at the seating chart." "Well," I replied calmly, "sometimes people don't see things until they're standing right in front of them." He looked down for a second, then he squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Hearing those words from him meant more than he probably realized, not because I needed an apology but because it meant he understood something had happened. "Thank you," I said. He sat there beside my chair for another moment, collecting himself. Then he said something that made my chest tighten a little. "When you said that line about a mother's love not sitting at a table number," he shook his head again. "That hit me pretty hard." I smiled gently. "Well," I said, "your father used to say something similar." Daniel chuckled quietly through his emotion. "Yeah, that sounds like Dad." For a few seconds we just sat there together while the music played across the room. Then he looked up at me again. "We're going to talk about this," he said firmly. "Not tonight, but soon." "That sounds like a good plan," I replied. He nodded, then he leaned forward and hugged me, not the quick, polite hug he had given earlier, a real one, the kind that lasts a few seconds longer than expected. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," I answered. When he stood up again, his shoulders looked lighter somehow. Like a weight had shifted, he headed back toward the dance floor where Patris was talking with guests. I watched him join the crowd again, smiling politely as people congratulated him. I didn't watch Patris. Instead, I turned my attention toward the dance floor. Sophie spotted me and waved excitedly. "Grandma, come dance," I laughed out loud. "Ha ha ha, all right, all right." I set my glass down and walked toward the music. Before long I found myself dancing with Sophie and Marcus, spinning under the lights like we were at a family party instead of a formal wedding. At one point an elderly man tapped my shoulder and asked politely, "Would you care to try the two-step?" His name was Gerald, Patris's great-uncle from Texas, and let me tell you something, that man could dance. "Ha ha ha," I laughed as he guided me across the floor. "You're going to make me look bad out here." "Not at all," he said with a grin. We danced twice. By the end of the second song, I was laughing harder than I had all evening. Sometimes life surprises you like that. Just when you think a moment will stay heavy forever, something small lifts it again. later that night. As the music played and the lights shimmered above the dance floor, I realized something important. The speech hadn't been about embarrassment. It hadn't been about revenge. It had simply been about standing up and reminding the room that I existed. And that realization made the rest of the evening feel lighter. But the real change, the one that mattered most, didn't happen until the next morning, because when I drove back home through the mountains at sunrise, something inside me had quietly shifted forever. The next morning, I left Charlotte before the sun was fully up. Weddings have a strange way of exhausting you, even when you're only a guest. Maybe it's the emotions. Maybe it's the music and the lights and the conversations that stretch late into the night. Whatever it is, when I woke up in that small guest room, the house was still quiet. Everyone else was asleep. For a moment I sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window toward the neighbor's fence again. The sky was just starting to turn pale gray with the first hint of morning sigh. Well, I whispered softly, that was quite a weekend. I packed my suitcase slowly, folded the burgundy dress carefully, checked the room to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. The house remained silent except for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs before leaving. I paused near the kitchen island, the same place where Patris had sat with her clipboard 2 days earlier, the same place where I first heard the words Table 14. For a moment I rested my hand on the counter, then I smiled faintly. Because strangely enough, that number didn't bother me anymore. Sometimes life gives you moments that reveal things more clearly than you expected. And once you see something clearly, it's hard to pretend you didn't notice. I left a small note on the counter for Daniel. Proud of you. Call me when things settle down. Love, Mom. Then I picked up my suitcase and stepped outside. The early morning air was cool and quiet. My car sat alone in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of dew. When I started the engine, the headlights cut through the pale blue light of dawn. The drive back to Asheville takes about 2 hours if traffic is light. That morning the roads were almost empty. The mountains appeared slowly as the sun rose higher, turning the sky soft shades of pink and gold. I rolled the window down a little and let the cool air fill the car. For the first half hour I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove, thinking sometimes after something emotional happens, your mind needs a little silence to sort through everything. I thought about Daniel kneeling beside my chair the night before. I didn't know, he had said, and I believed him. 31 years of knowing someone gives you a pretty good sense of their honesty. Daniel had looked genuinely shocked when he realized where I had been sitting, and that mattered, but something else mattered too. I realized that the speech I gave hadn't really been for the guests. It hadn't even been for Patris. It had been for myself. Because there comes a point in life when you stop pretending not to notice certain things. You stop accepting quiet corners. You stop shrinking your presence just to keep everyone else comfortable. I thought about Frank again during that drive. He had always been good at seeing situations clearly. If he had been at that wedding, he probably would have squeezed my hand and whispered one of his simple little pieces of wisdom. Carol, he'd say, never let anyone quietly move you to the edge of the room. I chuckled softly at the thought. Ha ha ha, you were right again, Frank. About halfway home, I finally turned on the radio. Some old country song started playing, the kind Frank used to hum while fixing things around the house. The mountains stretched out in front of me, calm and steady as always, and strangely enough, I felt lighter, like something I'd been carrying for a long time had finally been set down. In the weeks after the wedding, Daniel called more often than he had in the previous year combined. Our Sunday calls came back, just like before. One evening he said something that told me a lot had changed. Mom, he said quietly, I've been noticing things lately that I didn't see before. I didn't ask for details. Sometimes people need space to figure things out on their own, but I listened, and listening, after all these years, is something I've become pretty good at. Things between Patris and me are still complicated. I won't pretend otherwise. Relationships don't magically fix themselves overnight, but something did shift after that wedding. Some quiet dynamic that had been sitting under the surface for years finally became visible, and visible things can be dealt with. About a month ago, Daniel called again on a Sunday evening. Mom, he said, we're thinking about Thanksgiving. I smiled. Already, he said with a small laugh. Patris actually suggested we have dinner together this year. I paused, not because I was angry, just because life has taught me that some invitations deserve a little thought. Think about it. I told him, and I meant that honestly, because forgiveness is real, but so is wisdom, and both deserve their time. But there's one thing I know for certain now. I am done sitting at table 14. Not literally, tables are just furniture, but in the deeper sense of that phrase, I spent 64 years becoming the woman I am. I loved my husband for 30 years. I raised a son who grew into a good man. I have grandchildren who stand on chairs and clap for me when I speak, and I have danced the two-step with a man named Gerald from Texas. That alone makes life pretty interesting. More importantly, I learned something important that night. Standing up doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it simply means speaking calmly, reminding people that you are here, that you have always been here, and that your place in the room was earned long ago. So if you ever find yourself in a moment like that, A quiet table 14 moment in your own life where someone tries to move you politely to the edge of things. Remember this. You don't need to shout, you don't need to cause chaos. Sometimes all it takes is standing up, taking the microphone, and reminding the room who you are. And if stories like this remind you of moments from your own life, you're always welcome to stay here and listen to more of them. There are many stories people carry quietly in their hearts, and sharing them helps us remember we're not alone. So if you'd like to hear more real stories like this, you can follow along with the channel and join me again sometime, because life has a funny way of teaching us things, sometimes from the very back table of the room.